I raised my glass and thanked my grandfather for the $200. He stopped carving the turkey and looked up, his eyes sharp. He asked what $200 I meant, then told the entire table the gift he gave me was actually $500,000. In the silence that followed, I realized someone here had stolen a fortune, completely unaware that my actual job is hunting down people who leave digital footprints. My name is Lila Alexander. I am 32 years old, and I live my life in a series of encrypted tunnels and digital backdoors at HelixGate Analytics in Denver. My job title is Senior Cybersecurity Analyst, but in practice, I am a professional hunter of anomalies. I look for the single line of code that breaks the pattern, the fraction of a cent siphoned off into an offshore shell, the ghost login at 3 a.m. that suggests an employee is selling out their company. I trust data because numbers do not have agendas. They do not lie to protect your feelings, and they certainly do not smile at you while they pick your pocket. Returning to Redwood Falls always felt like stepping out of a high-speed server room and into a sepia photograph. The town did not change. The air here was thinner, colder, and smelled of pine needles and wood smoke. The King Estate, my grandfather's home, sat on a ridge overlooking the valley, a sprawling Victorian manor that looked exactly as it had when I was a child. It was a house built on old money and older values, or at least, that was the facade we polished every November. This Thanksgiving was supposed to be a ceasefire. I had spent the last week in Denver buried in a forensic audit for a mid-sized bank that had lost track of a significant amount of capital, and my eyes were tired from staring at glowing monitors. I wanted wine. I wanted turkey. I wanted to pretend, for 48 hours, that I was just a granddaughter and not a woman who knew how to ruin lives with a keyboard. The house was warm when I arrived. The heavy oak front door opened to the scent of roasting rosemary and cinnamon. The lighting was low and golden, casting long, comfortable shadows against the mahogany paneling. It was the kind of atmosphere that demanded you lower your voice and relax your shoulders. My grandfather, Walter King, was holding court in the living room. At 78, he was still the man who had built a local real estate empire from a single hardware store. He sat in his leather wingback chair, a glass of scotch in one hand, looking less like an old man and more like a retired general reviewing his troops. He had always been the moral compass of this family, the one person whose approval I actually sought. When he saw me, his face broke into a genuine grin, the kind that made the wrinkles around his eyes deepen in a way I loved. Then there was the rest of the cast. My father, Daniel Rhodes, stood by the fireplace. He was a quiet man, an accountant who had spent 30 years balancing books that never quite made him rich. He held his wine glass with a tightness that suggested he was afraid someone might take it away. My mother, Rebecca King Rhodes, was fluttering between the kitchen and the living room, her movements frantic and bird-like. She was a retired elementary school teacher who treated every family gathering like a performance review. And finally, Hannah, my younger sister. Hannah was sprawled on the velvet settee, her phone held aloft at the perfect 45-degree angle to catch the light. She was 26 and listed her occupation as lifestyle curator on social media. To me, she was simply unemployed with a trust fund mentality. She waved at me without breaking eye contact with her screen, ensuring her followers knew she was having a quintessential, authentic family holiday. The tension started in the kitchen. 2 hours before dinner, I had gone in to help with the cranberry sauce. My mother was there, wiping down a counter that was already spotless. When she saw me, she stopped and reached into her apron pocket. She pulled out a cream-colored envelope and pressed it into my hand. Her fingers were cold. She told me that Grandpa wanted me to have this. She lowered her voice to a whisper, glancing toward the hallway to make sure we were alone. She said that business had been slow for the estate this year and cash flow was a little tight, but he wanted to give me something. Inside the envelope was a check written in my mother's handwriting, signed with a shaky approximation of my grandfather's signature. It was for $200. My mother squeezed my hand. She told me to please not mention the amount to him. She said he was sensitive about not being able to do more this year, and she did not want him to feel embarrassed in front of Daniel and Hannah. She asked me to just say thank you and leave it at that. I looked at the check. $200. It was a token gesture, gas money essentially, but I felt a surge of affection for the old man. He was proud, and if things were tight, the fact that he thought of me at all mattered. I put the check in my blazer pocket and promised my mother I would handle it with discretion. I told her I would not make it awkward. I had no idea that I was walking into an ambush. Dinner was served in the formal dining room. The long table was set with the good china, the plates rimmed in gold leaf that had survived 3 generations. The turkey sat in the center, golden brown and steaming. My grandfather took his place at the head of the table, carving knife in hand. He looked powerful, vibrant. He did not look like a man who was struggling to scrape together a holiday bonus. The conversation started with the usual harmless noise. Hannah talked about her engagement metrics and a potential brand partnership with a vitamin water company that I was fairly certain was a pyramid scheme. My father nodded along, asking questions about tax write-offs that Hannah clearly did not understand. My mother kept piling stuffing onto everyone's plates, laughing a little too loudly at jokes that were not particularly funny. I sat quietly, observing. It was a professional habit. I watched the micro-expressions. I watched the way my father would take a long drink every time the conversation shifted toward money. I watched the way my mother kept glancing at the grandfather clock, as if she were trying to run out the clock on a game I did not know we were playing. Walter cleared his throat. The table went silent. He set the carving knife down and looked directly at me. His eyes were clear, sharp, and full of pride. He asked me, with a booming conviviality, how it felt to finally have some real capital to play with. He said he knew I had been renting that apartment in Denver for years, and he hoped this would give me the freedom to finally buy a place of my own, or perhaps invest in my own consultancy firm. The room seemed to tilt slightly to the left. I paused, my fork hovering halfway to my mouth. I assumed, in that split second, that his mind was slipping. He was talking about buying a house with $200. My mother had warned me he was sensitive, that things were tight. I decided to play along, to be the good granddaughter who protected his dignity. I smiled. A bright, projected thing. I raised my glass slightly and spoke clearly, so everyone could hear that I was grateful. I said, "Grandpa, thank you again for the $200. I really appreciate it." The reaction was instantaneous, though I did not understand it yet. My mother dropped her salad fork. It clattered against the china with a sound like a gunshot. Hannah stopped chewing. My father closed his eyes for a second, as if bracing for impact. Walter froze. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of genuine confusion, which then hardened into something steely and dangerous. He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. He asked me to repeat myself. He asked, "What $200?" I faltered, my smile wavering. I glanced at my mother, but she was staring intently at her water glass. I tried to maintain the charade. I told him it was okay, that the check was generous, and he did not need to worry. Walter cut me off. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that silenced the air conditioning hum. He spoke slowly, enunciating every syllable. He said, "The gift I gave you was $500,000. The silence that followed was absolute. It was physical. It pressed against my eardrums. The number hung in the air above the centerpiece, vast and impossible. $500,000, $500,000. I looked at my grandfather. He was not senile. He was not confused. He was angry. I looked at the check in my pocket, burning a hole through the fabric. $200. Then I looked at the rest of the table. The atmosphere had shifted from warm holiday glow to the cold, sterile light of an interrogation room. I saw them not as my family, but as subjects in an investigation. I saw Hannah. Her face had gone sheet white. Her hand was trembling so badly she had to set her wineglass down to keep from spilling it. She looked terrified. I saw Daniel, my father. He was gripping the stem of his glass with such force his knuckles were white. He was staring at a point on the wall behind Walter's head, refusing to look at me. Refusing to look at his father-in-law, I saw Rebecca, my mother. She let out a breathless, jagged laugh that sounded like glass breaking. She waved a hand dismissively. She told Grandpa that he must be remembering incorrectly. She said he was confusing this with something else. She tried to pivot the conversation to the turkey, to the weather, to anything else, but I was not listening to her anymore. My mind, trained to spot patterns in chaotic data streams, was already racing. It was assembling pieces I had ignored for days. The vague phone calls, the insistence that I did not need to come home this year, the check handed to me in secret, the warning not to speak about money. I realized my breath had caught in my throat. I looked at the faces of the people who shared my blood, and I saw the same look I saw on the faces of corporate embezzlers right before the audit team walked through the door: guilt, panic, and the desperate, silent hope that I was too stupid to do the math. I had spent the entire week chasing a ghost in a banking server, looking for a missing sum of money that had vanished into the ether. I had tracked IP addresses and analyzed login timestamps. I had treated it as an abstract puzzle, a game of cat and mouse with a faceless thief. But as I sat there, with the smell of roast turkey turning sour in my stomach, I realized I had made a fundamental error in my assessment. That night, under the crystal chandelier of the King estate, I realized the biggest case of my career was not sitting on a secure server in Denver. It was right here, sitting across from me, passing the gravy boat. The anomaly was in the room, and for the first time in my life, I was not just the investigator, I was the crime scene. 7 days before the dinner that would end my family as I knew it, I was sitting in my office at Helix Gate Analytics. The room was dark, illuminated only by the cool blue wash of 3 monitors. It was 9 at night on a Tuesday, and the rest of the building was silent. I preferred it this way. The hum of the cooling fans was white noise, a barrier between me and the chaotic, messy world outside. I was deep in the trenches of a forensic investigation for a healthcare provider in Chicago. They had been hit by a ransomware attack, a sophisticated one that had managed to bypass their firewalls by masquerading as a routine system update. My job was to trace the entry point, to find the digital fingerprint the hackers had left behind. I lived for this specific kind of focus. It was a state of flow where the world reduced itself to lines of code, timestamps, and IP addresses. In the data, there was no ambiguity. A login was either authorized or it was not. A file was either corrupted or it was clean. My phone buzzed against the mahogany desk, shattering the silence. The vibration made a harsh, rattling sound that made me jump. I looked at the screen. The name flashing there was Hannah. I stared at it for a long moment. My sister did not call me. We existed in separate universes. I lived in a world of logic and encryption. Hannah lived in a world of filters, angles, and engagement metrics. Her communication with me was usually limited to obligatory birthday texts, usually sent a day late, or group emails regarding holiday logistics where I was merely a CC'd recipient. A voice call at 9 at night was an anomaly. In my line of work, anomalies were red flags. I picked up the phone, swiping the green icon. I answered with a simple hello. Hannah's voice poured through the speaker, syrupy and breathless. It was a tone I recognized from her Instagram stories, the one she used when she was apologizing to her followers for not posting in 24 hours or explaining why a sponsored skincare product had given her a rash but was still totally worth buying. She said, "Lila, hey, oh my God, I am so glad I caught you. I know you are probably super busy saving the internet or whatever it is you do." I leaned back in my chair, rubbing the bridge of my nose. I asked her what was going on. She sighed, a long, dramatic exhalation that sounded rehearsed. She said she was calling with some bad news. She said she wanted to give me a heads up before I booked anything non-refundable. She told me that Grandpa was not doing well. My stomach tightened. The image of Walter King, broad-shouldered and invincible, flashed in my mind. I asked her what she meant. Hannah lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. She said he had been incredibly frail lately. She said he was tired all the time, forgetting things, just really slowing down. She told me that Mom and Dad were worried that the stress of hosting the big Thanksgiving dinner would be too much for him this year. She said they were thinking of canceling the whole thing, just keeping it small, just the immediate family in town. I frowned at the dark screen of my computer. Just the immediate family in town. That phrasing was specific. It drew a circle that included her, my parents, and Chase, but excluded me. She continued, her voice dripping with faux empathy. She said she knew how busy I was with my big projects in Denver. She said she felt terrible thinking about me flying all the way out there, spending all that money on plane tickets and taking time off work, only to find Grandpa sleeping in his chair the whole time. She said maybe it would be better if I just stayed in Denver this year, for my own sake, really. I stayed silent, letting her words hang in the air. Something was wrong. The pattern did not fit. 3 days ago, I had FaceTimed with Walter. He had been in the garage, wearing his old flannel shirt, complaining about the price of cedar lumber. He had been standing on a 6-foot ladder, changing a floodlight bulb because he refused to pay a handyman to do something he could do himself. He had looked vibrant. He had looked strong. He had teased me about my new haircut and asked if I was eating enough. That man did not align with the frail, confused invalid Hannah was painting for me now. And then there was the concern about my money. Hannah never talked about money unless she was asking for it or bragging about spending it. The idea that she was worried about the cost of my plane ticket was as likely as a phishing email asking for my password to verify my security. It was a social engineering tactic. It was an appeal to emotion designed to bypass critical thinking. I told her I appreciated the update. I kept my voice neutral, flat. I told her I would look into my schedule and let her know. She sounded relieved, almost too eager. She said that sounded great and to just take care of myself. She hung up quickly. I set the phone down on the desk. The silence of the office rushed back in, but the white noise of the fans no longer calmed me. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. The same sensation I got when I found a backdoor in a client's server. Someone was trying to manipulate the access logs. Someone was trying to revoke my credentials to the family home. I did not hesitate. I picked up the phone again and dialed my grandfather's landline. He answered on the second ring. His voice was booming, clear, and utterly devoid of frailty. He shouted my name. He sounded like he was in a good mood. I could hear background noise, the distinct chime of a door opening and the murmur of voices. I asked him how he was. He laughed. He told me he was fantastic. He said he was currently at the liquor store down on Main Street. He told me he was looking at a case of Cabernet that cost more than his first car, but he was going to buy it anyway. He said this year was going to be the biggest Thanksgiving we had in a decade. He said he wanted everything to be perfect for when I came home. I closed my eyes. The disconnect between Hannah's story and Walter's reality was not a misunderstanding. It was a fabrication. I spoke carefully. I told him I had heard he was feeling a bit under the weather. I said I was worried he might be overdoing it. Walter snorted. He asked who told me that. He said if anyone told me he was weak, they were projecting their own lack of character. He joked that he could still outlift my father and outrun Hannah's new boyfriend without breaking a sweat. He told me to stop worrying and just make sure I was hungry when I got there. We said our goodbyes, and I ended the call. I sat there in the dark, my hand still gripping the phone. The cold metal felt like a weapon. My grandfather was fine. He was planning a feast. He was expecting me. Yet, my sister had just spent 10 minutes trying to convince me he was on death's door. She had tried to convince me to stay away, and she had cited my parents as the source of this concern. Why? Why would my family want to exclude me from a holiday we had celebrated together every year of my life? Why use my grandfather's health as the leverage? It was cruel. It was unnecessary. Unless my presence was a threat. I turned back to my monitors. The lines of code from the Chicago hospital hack blurred together. I could not focus. The logical part of my brain, the part that solved puzzles for a living, was screaming at me. You do not block a user from the system unless you are trying to hide an unauthorized activity. You do not quarantine a file unless it contains evidence you do not want seen. My mind began to drift backward. I thought about the dynamic of the last few months, the vague emails from my father, The way my mother changed the subject whenever I asked about the estate upkeep. The way Hannah had suddenly upgraded her wardrobe from fast fashion to designer labels that I knew she could not afford on an influencer's income. I thought about money. Money was always the root code of the King family. My grandfather had it. My parents managed it. Hannah wanted it. I had built a career to ensure I never needed to ask for it. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. When I was 18, right before I left for college, Walter had taken me to the bank. He had opened a joint checking account with me. He had put $10,000 in it. He told me it was for emergencies. He told me that if I ever got stuck, if I ever needed a flight home, or a bail bond, or a safe place to sleep, the money was there. He said he wanted his name on it so he could transfer funds instantly if I was ever in trouble. I had used it sparingly in college for books and a deposit on my first apartment. After I graduated and started making my own salary, I had stopped touching it. I had not logged into that account in years. I assumed it sat there, dormant, gathering dust and a few cents of interest, a relic of a time when I needed a safety net. But tonight, the anomaly in my sister's voice made me question every assumption I held. I opened a new tab on my browser. The incognito window was a reflex. I typed in the URL for Frontier Trust Bank. The homepage loaded, bright and blue. I stared at the login fields. I had to cycle through 3 different variations of my old passwords before I found the right combination. I had to answer security questions that felt like they belonged to a stranger. What was the name of your first pet buster? What is your mother's maiden name, King? The screen refreshed. A loading wheel spun for 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds felt longer than the entire week I had spent in Denver. If Hannah was lying about Grandpa's health, what else were they lying about? Why did they need me to stay in Denver? What was happening at that table that could not survive my scrutiny? I decided then and there, I would not trust their words. Words could be finessed. Tone could be faked. Tears could be manufactured. I would trust the only thing that had never betrayed me. I would trust the data. The dashboard of the bank account flashed onto the screen. My eyes went immediately to the balance. I expected to see a few $1,000s, maybe less, if bank fees had eaten away at it over the decade. I blinked. I leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light reflecting in my pupils. The balance was not what I expected. It was not a dormant account. It was active. I clicked on the transaction history tab. The list populated, row after row of data. Dates, merchants, transfers, withdrawals. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. A slow, heavy rhythm of dread. I was looking at a crime scene. I was looking at a digital autopsy of my family's integrity. And as I scrolled down, tracing the movement of numbers that should not have existed, I realized that Hannah's phone call was not a friendly suggestion. It was a desperate attempt to keep the victim away from the evidence. I was not just the granddaughter anymore. I was the auditor, and the audit had just begun. The monitor cast a harsh, blue-white pallor over my face as the transaction history finally populated. For a moment, the screen looked exactly as I expected it to look. It was a digital ghost town. There were years of silence, a long, empty scroll of zeros and inactivity stretching back to my college graduation. The interest payments were pennies, accumulating dust in a vault I had forgotten existed. Then I scrolled up to the top of the page, to the activity from 3 months ago. The breath left my lungs in a sharp, silent hiss. There, dated August 14th, was a deposit. It was labeled simply as incoming wire transfer, and the sender was Walter King. The amount was not a birthday check. It was not an emergency fund. It was $500,000. I blinked, leaning closer to the screen until the pixels blurred. I actually wiped the monitor with my thumb, as if the comma was a smudge of dust I could clear away, but the number remained. $500,000, $500,000. My first reaction was not anger. It was not even suspicion. It was a flat, absolute disbelief. My brain, trained to look for logical patterns, immediately rejected the data. This had to be a clerical error. This was a bank glitch, a routing number mistyped by a tired teller that had accidentally dumped corporate capital into a dormant personal account. My grandfather was wealthy. Yes, but he did not just wire $500,000 to a granddaughter he rarely saw without a phone call, a contract, or at least a card. This was the kind of money that came with lawyers and signatures, not a silent electronic beep in the middle of August. I moved my mouse to the next line. 24 hours later, August 15th, outgoing wire transfer. $499,800. The balance had plummeted back to near zero in the span of a single rotation of the Earth. The money had touched down in the account just long enough to clear, and then it had vanished. I sat back in my chair, the leather creaking loudly in the empty office. This was not a glitch. Glitches do not clean up after themselves. Glitches do not leave a balance of exactly $200 behind. I felt a cold prickle of adrenaline start at the base of my spine. This was the feeling I got when I found a rootkit in a client's server. The realization that an intruder was not just knocking at the door, but was already inside the house, eating from the fridge. I cracked my knuckles and leaned forward. If this was a theft, it was sloppy. Speed usually meant panic, and panic meant mistakes. I clicked on the transaction details for the withdrawal. The bank's interface gave me the basics, which were a confirmation number and a routing destination, but I needed more. I opened my terminal and ran a script I had written years ago, a tool designed to parse the metadata of authorized user logins. I needed to know who had opened the door to let the money out. The system queried the bank's access logs. It took a minute, the cursor blinking rhythmically. Result found. Device MacBook Pro, 16-inch, 2023 model. OS. Mac OS. Sonoma 14.1. Browser Safari. IP address 192.168.1.45. Local. Mapped to a public static IP registered to a residential ISP in Redwood Falls. I stared at the IP address. It was not my parents' house. I knew their IP range by heart because I had set up their firewall myself 5 years ago. It was not the estate, either. Walter refused to get high-speed fiber because he did not trust the cables, so he was still running on a slow DSL line that pinged from a completely different subnet. This login had come from a high-speed residential connection in the center of town. I copied the IP address and pasted it into a geolocation tool. The map zoomed in, dropping a red pin on a building I recognized only from architectural digests. The Vantage. It was a new luxury condominium complex downtown, the kind of place that advertised concierge service and a rooftop infinity pool. I did not know anyone who lived at the Vantage. I opened a new browser window and accessed the county property tax records. They were public domain. Easy to search if you knew how to navigate the archaic government database. I typed in the address of the building and filtered for unit numbers associated with the IP block. The search returned a name, Chase Lowell. I stopped breathing for a second. Chase, the man Hannah had been dating for 11 months, the man she called an entrepreneur, though she could never quite explain what it was he actually built or sold. I looked back at the bank log. The login credentials used were mine. The password used was one of my old variations, but the device was his. The location was his. I felt a wave of nausea, but I pushed it down. I needed to be sure. In my line of work, coincidence was a theory, but correlation was evidence. I opened Instagram. I navigated to Hannah's profile. My sister lived her life in high definition. She documented everything, from her morning latte to her evening skincare routine. If they had spent the money, the receipt would be right there on her grid, hidden in plain sight. I scrolled back to August 14th, the day the money arrived. Hannah had posted a photo of a packed suitcase, Louis Vuitton, with the caption, "Big things coming, manifesting abundance." August 16th, the day after the money vanished. The location tag was Maldives. The photo showed Hannah in a white bikini, holding a glass of champagne on the deck of an overwater bungalow. The caption read, "Sometimes you just have to treat yourself. Blessed." I cross-referenced the cost of the bungalow. The resort was the Waldorf Astoria Maldives Ithafushi. A night there cost upwards of $3,000. She had stayed for 10 days. I kept scrolling. September, Santorini, a private yacht charter. October, Las Vegas, A suite at the Wynn. I pulled up the transaction history on the bank account again. There were other, smaller hits, following the massive withdrawal, charges that looked innocuous to an untrained eye. HG Services, Global Concierge Limited, LR Ventures. I ran the merchant codes. They were not business expenses. HG Services was a shell merchant often used to mask payments to high-end travel agencies. Global Concierge mapped directly to a VIP hosting service in Vegas. They were burning through the cash, and they were doing it while pretending to be a startup. But there was one transaction that made me pause. It was the most recent one, dated just yesterday. Withdrawal cash, counter service, branch 044, Redwood Falls, amount $200. I stared at that line until the numbers seemed to burn into my retinas. $200. The check in my pocket felt heavy, like a stone. My mother had handed me that check this afternoon. She had told me it was a gift from Grandpa. She had told me things were tight. She had told me not to mention it. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, that $200 was not a gift from Walter's struggling estate. It was the scraps of my own money. It was the debris left over after they had looted the vault. Someone, Chase, Hannah, maybe even my parents had walked into the bank yesterday, used my credentials or a forged authorization, and withdrawn the last $200 from the $500,000 stolen fortune. Then my mother had written a check for that exact amount and handed it to me, framing it as an act of charity. It was not just theft, it was theater. They were laughing at me. They were so confident in my ignorance, so sure that I was just the tech support daughter who lived far away and never checked her balances, that they were feeding me my own money and expecting me to say thank you. I felt a cold, hard rage settle in my chest. It was a different kind of anger than I had ever felt before. It was quiet. It was clarifying. I did not scream. I did not throw the monitor. I went to work. I exported the entire transaction log as a CSV file. I took screenshots of every single page, capturing the timestamps, the IP addresses, and the merchant codes. I went to the county records site and downloaded the deed to Chase Lowell's apartment. I went to Hannah's Instagram and used a scraping tool to download every photo and caption from the last 3 months, preserving the metadata that proved where she was and when. I compiled it all into a folder. Then I encrypted the folder with a 256-bit key. I uploaded one copy to a secure cloud server that I owned, one that HelixGate used for sensitive evidence. I put a second copy on an encrypted USB drive attached to my keychain. I printed a third copy. The pages warm as they slid out of the laser printer, and organized them into a neat stack. My instinct was to pick up the phone. I wanted to call Walter. I wanted to tell him that his granddaughter was being robbed blind by the people eating his turkey, but I stopped my hand before it reached the receiver. If I called now, I would be reacting. I would be the hysterical granddaughter making accusations over the phone. They would deny it. They would say it was a misunderstanding. They would say I gave them permission and forgot. They would say I was jealous of Hannah's success. They would have time to delete emails, shred documents, and coach their stories until they matched. They thought I was stupid. They thought I was compliant. I needed to let them keep thinking that. When a hacker thinks they have undetected access to a system, they get lazy. They get greedy. They start leaving more fingerprints because they believe the security team is asleep. I would go to dinner. I would eat the turkey. I would smile at Hannah and ask about her trip to the Maldives. I would thank my grandfather for the $200 again, just to watch my mother squirm. I would let them think they had gotten away with it, and while they celebrated their cleverness, I would be building a cage around them that they would not see until the bars slammed shut. I powered down the monitor. The room plunged back into darkness, save for the blinking light of the printer. One question remained, nagging at the back of my mind like a corrupted line of code. Where did the $500,000 come from? Walter was rich, but he was cash poor. His wealth was in land, in buildings, in assets that took months to liquidate. You do not just move $500,000 in cash on a Tuesday in August without a major liquidity event. He had not sold a building recently. I monitored the real estate wires. And why send it to me? Why silently deposit a fortune into an account I never used? If he wanted to give me money, he would have called. He would have made a speech. He would have wanted to see my face. Unless he did not send it, or unless he did send it. But he thought he was sending it to a version of me that existed only in the lies my family told him. The mystery was not just who took the money, it was why the money was there to be taken. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Denver skyline. In 24 hours, I would be in Redwood Falls. I would be walking into a house full of liars with a briefcase full of truth. I checked my watch. It was 11 at night. The banks were closed. The transactions were finalized. The money was gone. But the receipt remained, and I was going to make sure they paid the bill. The morning after I discovered the theft, my phone rang at 9 o'clock sharp. The caller ID displayed my mother's face. A photo taken 3 years ago at a beach picnic where everyone was smiling and nobody was stealing six-figure sums from each other. I stared at the screen for a long moment, letting the device buzz against the hard wood of my desk. My heart rate did not spike. My hands did not shake. I felt a cold, clinical detachment, the kind I usually reserved for interviewing suspects in corporate espionage cases. I swiped to answer and put the phone on speaker. I opened a recording application on my laptop and watched the audio waveform begin to ripple in sync with the ambient noise of the room. My mother's voice filled the office. It was a masterpiece of maternal gaslighting. She sounded tired, affectionate, and just a little bit frantic. She started by asking if I had slept well, but she did not wait for an answer before pivoting to the real reason for her call. She told me that she wanted to give me a little context about Grandpa before I came home. She said that his age was finally catching up to him in ways that were becoming difficult to manage. She lowered her voice, as if sharing a shameful family secret, and told me that he had started mixing up his accounts. She said he would transfer money around, forget he had done it, and then get angry when the balances looked wrong. She told me that if I saw anything strange, or if he mentioned sending me anything, I should just ignore it. She said she and my father were handling it. They were fixing his mistakes. I sat in silence, watching the blue line of her voice bounce across my screen. It was a clean, rehearsed narrative. It was designed to preemptively discredit the evidence I had found. If I asked about the $500,000, she would simply sigh and say, "Yes, that was one of his episodes." We reversed it immediately. Then came the command wrapped in a request. She told me that I absolutely must not mention money at Thanksgiving dinner. She said that Hannah was going through a delicate transition. She said my sister was launching a startup with Chase, a venture capital firm, or a lifestyle brand. She wasn't quite sure, but it was very high stress. She said Hannah was sensitive about finances right now, especially with me being so established. She asked me to be the bigger person. She asked me to just let the weekend be about family and gratitude, not about bank accounts. I agreed. I told her I would not say a word about money. I told her I understood completely. When I hung up, I saved the audio file as evidence item 1. An hour later, an email arrived from my father. Daniel Rhodes was a man who avoided conflict the way most people avoided oncoming traffic. He was a quiet accountant who preferred the certainty of a spreadsheet to the unpredictability of human emotion. For him to reach out directly, without my mother CC'd on the chain, was an event in itself. The subject line was simply, "Family Matters." The body of the email was short, vague, and terrified. He wrote that he was attaching a summary of the family assets, so I would not feel the need to worry about the estate. He wrote that everyone was just trying to do their best in a difficult economy. He ended with a sentence that made my stomach turn. He told me not to dig too deep into the past, because I was living a good life in Denver and I should focus on that. It was a plea. It was a warning. I opened the attachment. It was a Microsoft Excel file titled Internal Allocations. I did not just read the document, I dissected it. I ran it through the same analysis software I used to catch executives embezzling company funds. The spreadsheet was a work of fiction. It listed a series of loans and capital infusions designated as family business support. But the recipient of these loans was not Hannah. It was not Chase. It was me. According to this file, I had received 4 separate transfers over the last 11 months, totaling nearly $300,000. They were labeled as consulting fees, brand development support, and personal hardship loans. Next to each entry was a digital notation claiming that a signed authorization was on file. I had never seen this money. I had never signed these papers. I zoomed in on the metadata of the file. This was where amateurs always made their mistakes. They thought that what they typed in the cells was the only story the file told. They forgot that every digital document carries the DNA of its creation. The spreadsheet claimed to record transactions from January, March, and June, but the file creation date was last Tuesday. The author was listed as Daniel Rhodes. The total editing time was 45 minutes. My father had not been tracking these loans for a year. He had panic-created this spreadsheet 5 days ago, likely right after Hannah told them I might be coming home. He had backdated the entries to match the times when Chase and Hannah had been spending lavishly on their trips. They were using my name as a dump truck to carry their debt. They were building a paper trail that said Lila Alexander took the money, not Hannah Rhodes. But the real revelation, the one that turned my blood to ice, was not in the spreadsheet itself. It was in the email chain. My father, in his haste or his technological incompetence, had not created a new email to send to me. He had forwarded an existing thread, deleted the text in the body, and typed his new message over it, but he had forgotten to expand the history tab to check what was buried underneath. I scrolled down, past his warning, past the signature block. There was a conversation dated 3 weeks ago. It was between my parents and Arthur Henderson, the family attorney who had managed the King estate for 40 years. My mother had written to Henderson. She asked if there was a way to restructure the distribution of Walter's liquid assets so that Hannah could access the capital immediately without incurring a gift tax or alerting Walter to the speed of the withdrawal. She suggested categorizing it as an investment in my name. Since I had a pre-existing joint account with Walter, she wrote that I was busy and would not mind helping my sister out, so she could sign the papers on my behalf. Henderson's reply was blunt. He wrote that signing a legal document on behalf of another adult without a notarized power of attorney was forgery. He wrote that moving funds under false pretenses was wire fraud. He wrote that he could not, in good conscience, facilitate a transaction that exposed the estate to criminal liability. He declined to assist them further and suggested they inform Walter of their intentions immediately. That was where the thread with Henderson ended. But there was one more email below that, a forward from my mother to my father. It was dated 2 days after Henderson's refusal. It was brief. She wrote that she had found someone else. She said there was a lawyer in the city, a man named Miller, who understood that families needed flexibility. She told Daniel to prepare the spreadsheets and to make sure my name was on everything. She wrote that it was better this way. She wrote that if Lila ever found out, we would just tell her it was for tax purposes and she would understand. I stared at the screen. The office air conditioner hummed, a low, monotonous drone that sounded like a swarm of bees. This was not just my sister being greedy. This was not just a bratty sibling stealing from the cookie jar. This was a conspiracy. My parents, the people who had taught me to look both ways before crossing the street, the people who had punished me for lying about finishing my homework, had sat down at their kitchen table and planned a felony. They had actively sought out a corrupt lawyer because the honest one refused to help them commit a crime. They had decided, collectively, that my identity was a resource they could harvest. They were not just stealing money, they were stealing my reputation. They were using my credit, my name, and my history as a responsible adult to camouflage their theft. They were banking on the fact that I was successful enough not to notice, or perhaps passive enough not to press charges if I did. The betrayal hit me in waves. First, it was the money. Then, it was the lies. But the heaviest wave was the realization of how little they thought of me. To them, I was not a person, I was a mechanism. I was a convenient legal entity that could be used to launder their conscience. I reached for my phone again. I opened the voice recorder app and set it to run in the background of every call. I opened a script on my laptop that would automatically archive every text message from my family to a secure server in Switzerland. I was no longer just a suspicious daughter. I was building a case file. I thought about the police. I had enough evidence right now, sitting on my hard drive, To get a warrant. I could have a squad car rolling up the long driveway of the King estate before the turkey was even out of the oven. I could watch them be led out in handcuffs, my mother weeping, my father silent, Hannah screaming that it was unfair. But then I thought of Walter. My grandfather was a man of the old world. He believed in honor. He believed that a man's name was his only real currency. He loved my mother. He adored Hannah, even when she was foolish. If I dropped a nuclear bomb of criminal charges on the family while he was sitting at the head of the table, it would not just destroy them, it would break him. I imagined him clutching his chest as the police read his daughter her rights. I imagined the shame that would haunt his final years, knowing that the empire he built had funded a den of thieves. I could not do that to him, not yet. But I also could not let this stand. I sat there in the silence of my apartment, the city of Denver sprawling out below me in a grid of lights. I had 2 monitors on my desk. On the left screen was the investigation for the Chicago hospital. It was a complex web of Russian botnets and encrypted payloads, a puzzle of international cyber warfare. On the right screen was the investigation into my own bloodline, the backdated spreadsheets, the forged signatures, the photos of my sister drinking champagne in the Maldives on my dime, the email from my mother coordinating the fraud. I looked at the left screen, then I looked at the right. I reached out and minimized the hospital investigation. I sent a quick message to my project manager telling him I had a family emergency and would be offline for 48 hours. I was not going home to celebrate Thanksgiving. I was going home to conduct a raid. I pulled up the passenger list for my flight the next morning. I checked my luggage allowance. I would need space for my portable projector. I would need space for the hard drives. I would need space for the printed dossiers I was about to compile. My mother had told me to be the bigger person. She had told me to protect the family. I intended to do exactly that. I would protect the only member of the family who actually deserved it. I started typing a new script, one that would scrape the financial records of Chase Lowell's shell company. The cursor blinked. A steady, rhythmic heartbeat. The line between justice and revenge is often just a matter of who is telling the story. And this time, I was going to be the one holding the pen. I did not pack a black dress for Thanksgiving. I packed a dossier. The decision to return to Redwood Falls was no longer about family obligation. It was an operational necessity. If I stayed in Denver, I was a victim in absentia, a silent partner in a fraud scheme that used my name to launder a fortune. If I went back, I was an active threat. I treated the preparation for the trip not like a holiday homecoming, but like a penetration test on a high-security facility. My apartment living room had transformed into a command center. The floor was covered in stacks of paper, organized by timeline and severity. I had printed everything. Digital evidence is powerful, but there is something undeniable about physical paper. You can claim a screenshot is photoshopped. You can claim a bank log is a glitch. You cannot easily dismiss a 3-inch stack of documents that details every single lie you have told for the last 6 months. I organized the file into exhibits. Exhibit A was the bank logs from Frontier Trust. I highlighted the incoming wire of $500,000 and the outgoing wire of nearly the same amount 24 hours later. Exhibit B was the forgery. I had scanned the power of attorney document my father had attached to the email. I printed it on a transparency sheet and overlaid it with a scan of my actual signature from my driver's license. The difference was laughable. The loop on the L was wrong. The slant was too steep. It was a caricature of my handwriting, likely practiced by my mother on a notepad while watching television. Exhibit C was the email chain. I printed the rejection from Arthur Henderson, the family lawyer who had refused to break the law. I highlighted the timestamp where my parents immediately pivoted to finding a flexible attorney. This was the smoking gun that proved intent. They knew it was illegal, and they did it anyway. But the most damning section of the dossier was the one dedicated to Chase Lowell. I had spent the previous night digging into Lowell Ridge Ventures, LLC, the company that had received several of the smaller consulting transfers, using public business registry tools. I pulled the articles of incorporation. The company had been formed 6 months ago. The registered agent was a generic legal service. The business address listed was a suite in a commercial building in downtown Denver. I knew that building. I drove past it every day on my way to Helix Gate. I pulled up Google Maps and zoomed in on the street view. Suite 400 was not a venture capital firm. It was a mail drop service located next to a dry cleaner. Lowell Ridge Ventures had no employees, no revenue filings, and a credit history that consisted entirely of 3 unpaid inquiries from credit card companies. It was a ghost ship designed to carry stolen cargo. That was sloppy, but it was not surprising. What I found next, however, turned the situation from a family grievance into a predator hunt. At Helix Gate, we were currently processing a massive data dump from a credit reporting agency that had suffered a breach earlier in the year. It was millions of lines of raw data, social security numbers, credit scores, bankruptcy filings that we were analyzing for a client. It was not public information, but I had clearance to query the database. I ran a query for Chase Lowell. The system spun for a moment, and then spit out a result that made my blood run cold. Chase had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy 4 years ago in Arizona. But the filing had been sealed, likely due to a settlement agreement involving a harassment suit that was referenced in the footnotes. The bankruptcy discharge wiped out $200,000 of debt. But the database gave me something more valuable than his financial history. It gave me his old email addresses. One of them, a generic Gmail account, had been compromised in a separate leak from a luxury travel forum 3 years ago. I took that email address and ran a reverse search on a few OSINT forums I frequented. I found a thread on a consumer protection board from 2 years ago. The user was anonymous, but the story was specific. The poster warned other women about a man named Charles, who claimed to be an investment banker. He had romanced her, convinced her that he needed to move money through her account to optimize his tax exposure before a big merger, and then vanished, leaving her with a drained savings account and a massive tax bill. The email address linked to the forum account matched Chase's old email. I dug deeper. I found another woman in Seattle with a similar story on a different board, then another in Austin. The pattern was identical. He targeted women who had access to family money, but were insecure about their own financial literacy. He used the tax avoidance excuse to get access to their accounts, or to get them to sign over funds. He always insisted on secrecy, framing it as a sophisticated financial maneuver that regular people would not understand. I needed to be sure. I found the contact information for the woman in Seattle, whose name was Sarah. It was late, but I called her. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice guarded. I introduced myself. I told her I was investigating a man who might be using the alias Chase Lowell, but who used to go by Charles. I gave her the email address. There was a long silence on the other end. Then, I heard a sharp intake of breath. She asked me if he was driving a black Range Rover. I told her he was currently driving my sister's Mercedes. But yes, the profile fit. She told me everything. He had charmed her for 6 months. He had met her parents. He had even proposed. Then, 2 weeks before the wedding, he claimed his assets were frozen due to a misunderstanding with the IRS. He asked to move $300,000 through her account to pay a vendor for his business. She signed the authorization. The money came in from her father's account, and then it went out to an offshore entity. Chase disappeared 3 days later. She told me she was still paying off the legal fees. She told me her father had never forgiven her. I thanked her and hung up. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from a cold, hard realization. Hannah was not just a co-conspirator, she was a mark. My parents were not just thieves, they were accomplices to a con artist who had played them like a fiddle. They thought they were being clever by stealing from me to help Hannah, but they were actually shoveling the family fortune into a furnace. I needed legal leverage. I could not just walk into dinner with a sad story. I needed the weight of the law behind me. I made an appointment with a criminal defense attorney in Denver named Marcus Thorne. He was expensive, aggressive, and had absolutely no ties to the King family or Redwood Falls. I sat in his glass-walled office and laid out the spreadsheet, the forged signature, and the witness account from Sarah. Thorne looked over the documents in silence. He adjusted his glasses. He asked me if I understood what I was looking at. I told him I saw fraud. He corrected me. He said I was looking at grand larceny, wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy. He said that because the wire transfer crossed state lines, it was a federal offense. He pointed to the email from my mother. He said that email alone carried a potential prison sentence of 5 years because it proved premeditation. I asked him if the fact that it was family mattered. He looked at me with pity. He told me that the law does not have a sibling discount. He said that if I reported this, the district attorney would prosecute. He said my parents would likely lose their licenses. My father would never work as an accountant again. My mother would lose her pension eligibility. Chase would go to prison for a long time, given his prior history. He asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted the money back, and I wanted to make sure they could never use my name again. Thorne leaned back. He advised me to give them one chance. He said that once the police were involved, I would lose control of the train. It would destroy the family permanently. He suggested I present the evidence to the patriarch, my grandfather. Let him be the judge. But he warned me. I had to be ready to pull the trigger if they did not surrender. He told me to prepare the affidavit. He had his paralegal draft a formal complaint for the FBI and the local police, leaving the date blank. He put it in a crisp blue folder. He told me that if things went south, I should walk out of the house and drive straight to the police station. I left his office with the blue folder tucked into my bag. It felt like I was carrying a loaded gun. I returned to my apartment to finalize the logistics. I knew how these family arguments went. There would be screaming. There would be gaslighting. My mother would cry. Hannah would play the victim. My father would try to blur the facts with vague accounting terms. They would try to drown me out. I needed to control the narrative. I needed to make sure they could not interrupt the truth. I sat down at my desk and opened the webcam on my laptop. I fixed my hair. I put on a neutral expression. I pressed record. I spoke directly to the camera. I did not shout. I did not cry. I laid out the facts chronologically. I said, "My name is Lila Alexander. On August 14th, $500,000 was wired to an account in my name. On August 15th, it was stolen. The people who stole it are sitting at this table." I walked through the evidence, holding up the documents one by one to the camera. I explained the IP addresses. I explained the forged signature. I explained who Chase really was. I spoke for 10 minutes. It was a deposition delivered in advance. I saved the video file to my laptop and to my phone. Then, I went to an electronics store. I bought a high-lumen portable projector, the kind used for business presentations in bright rooms. I bought a heavy-duty HDMI cable. I bought a portable screen that folded down into a small tube, just in case there was no clear wall. I went back to my car and packed. I put the primary USB drive in my pocket. I put a backup drive in the lining of my suitcase. I hid a third drive under the spare tire in the trunk of my rental car. I treated the data like nuclear launch codes. I packed my clothes, but they felt like costumes. I chose a sharp, tailored blazer and dark trousers. It was armor. I wanted to look like the professional they had underestimated. As I zipped up my suitcase, I looked around my apartment. It was quiet. It was safe. It was paid for with money I had earned honestly. I thought about Walter. I thought about the pride in his voice when he talked about the family name. He believed we were better than this. He believed we were honest people. I was about to break his heart. But if I did not do this, I would be letting them sell his legacy for a few trips to the Maldives and a fake investment firm. I drove to the airport in the pre-dawn darkness. The city lights blurred past me. I boarded the plane to Redwood Falls with the blue folder in my carry-on. The flight attendant smiled at me and asked if I was going home for the holidays. I looked at her. I did not smile back. I told her I was going on a business trip. I sat in my seat and watched the ground fall away. I made a promise to myself as we climbed through the clouds. There are two kinds of peace. There is the peace you get by swallowing the poison and pretending it is wine. And there is the peace you get by spitting it out, even if it stains the tablecloth. I was done swallowing the poison. I closed my eyes and ran through the plan one last time. The projector, the folder, the video, the exit strategy. I was ready. The table was set, and I was bringing the carving knife. The dining room was a masterclass in performed happiness. My mother had outdone herself with the decor. The table was a long, polished expanse of mahogany, groaning under the weight of porcelain platters and crystal goblets. Tall tapered candles flickered in silver holders, casting a soft, forgiving light that smoothed out wrinkles and made the tension in my father's jaw look almost like a shadow. The air smelled of roasted sage, heavy cream, and the expensive Pinot Noir that my grandfather had uncorked an hour ago. I sat at the middle of the table, sandwiched between an aunt who smelled of lavender and a cousin who was too busy texting under the table to notice the war brewing around him. To my right was my sister, Hannah. To the head of the table sat Walter, the emperor of this little kingdom, looking flushed and content. For the last hour, I had been a ghost. I ate my turkey. I passed the green bean casserole. I smiled when required. But behind my eyes, I was running a surveillance operation. I was not tasting the food. I was recording the metadata of the evening. I watched the way my mother's eyes darted to my father every time the conversation lulled. I watched the way my father refilled his wineglass before it was even half empty. I watched Hannah, who was currently the star of the show, performing a monologue that would have made a reality TV producer proud. Hannah held up her left hand, letting the chandelier catch the light of the diamond on her finger. It was a massive stone, ostentatious and blinding. She announced that Chase had designed it himself. She said he wanted something that symbolized their journey together, something bold and timeless. She called it an investment in their shared brand. A chorus of coos and gasps went up from the relatives. My Aunt Linda leaned across the table, clutching her chest, and told Hannah she was the luckiest girl in the world. She said it was so inspiring to see young people taking such big swings in life. Hannah beamed, soaking up the adoration like a plant turning toward the sun. She tossed her hair back and talked about their upcoming itinerary. She mentioned they were scouting locations in Fiji for a wellness retreat they planned to launch next quarter. She used words like synergy, aesthetic, and abundance mindset. She said that in the modern economy, you had to spend money to signal value. I looked at the ring. I did the mental math. Based on the cut and clarity, that was easily a $30,000 diamond. That was not Chase's money. That was not Hannah's money. That was my money. I was looking at my own stolen savings, crystallized and mounted on my sister's finger, being paraded around as a symbol of her success. My mother, Rebecca, decided this was the perfect moment to draw a comparison. She leaned forward, her face flushed with wine and pride. She looked at the table and then landed her gaze on me, her smile tight and patronizing. She said that she was just so proud of Hannah for having the courage to live big. She said that some people were content to play it safe, to just hoard their paycheck and sit in a dark office all day. But Hannah was out there grabbing life by the horns. She looked directly at me and added that maybe I could learn a thing or two about enjoying myself. She said I was always so serious, so focused on saving for a rainy day that I missed the sunshine. The table laughed politely. It was the old family narrative, Lila the boring worker bee, Hannah the vibrant butterfly. I took a sip of water. The water was cold. It helped settle the fire in my stomach. I did not defend myself. I did not point out that my boring job paid for the roof over my head. While Hannah's bravery was funded by grand larceny, I just smiled a thin, brittle smile and nodded. My father, Daniel, did not laugh. He was staring into his wineglass as if the bottom of it held the solution to a complex equation. He looked pale. Sweat had beaded on his upper lip, despite the coolness of the room. Every time Hannah mentioned a dollar amount or a luxury brand, he flinched. He was drinking with a desperate, rhythmic efficiency. Walter was watching them too. He sat at the head of the table, slicing a piece of ham with precise, deliberate movements. He listened to Hannah's stories about Fiji and private villas. Occasionally, his eyebrows would knit together, a flicker of skepticism crossing his face when the numbers she threw around didn't quite add up for a girl who had never held a salaried job. But he said nothing. He loved her. He wanted to believe the fairy tale she was spinning just as much as everyone else did. The dinner dragged on. Plates were cleared. The conversation shifted from travel to local gossip, then back to Hannah's wedding plans. The air in the room grew heavier, thick with the unspoken secrets that were bouncing between my parents and my sister. They were terrified. I could see it in the way they avoided eye contact with me. They were waiting for me to ask a question, to mention a transaction, to ruin the script. But I stuck to the script my mother had given me. I played the role of the ignorant daughter. I asked Hannah about the color scheme for the wedding. I asked my father how his golf game was. I let them relax. I let them think they had successfully managed me. Then came dessert. My mother brought out a pumpkin pie and a tiered tray of pastries. The mood at the table was high. The wine had done its work. The danger seemed to have passed. Walter tapped his spoon against his glass. The sharp, clear chime cut through the chatter. The room fell silent. He stood up, holding his glass of port. He looked older tonight, but strong. He looked like a man who had worked hard for every inch of ground he stood on. He cleared his throat. He said he wanted to propose a toast. He looked around the table, smiling at his cousins, his neighbors, his children. Then his eyes landed on me. His expression softened. It was a look of genuine, unadulterated pride. He said that this year, he was especially thankful for the future. He said he had watched his grandchildren grow up, and he had worried about them, as all grandfathers do. But this year, he felt a deep sense of relief. He looked at me and said, "Lila, I want to single you out." The room went quiet. My mother froze. The pie server hovering halfway to a plate. Walter continued. He said he knew he had always been hard on us about the value of $1. He said he preached saving and thriftiness, but he said he also knew that there came a time when you had to trust the next generation to build something of their own. He raised his glass higher. He said, "So, Lila, how does it feel to finally have some real capital to play with? I hope you use it to build something magnificent. You have earned my trust, and I want to see you fly." The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of a toast. It was confused. The relatives looked at each other. Real capital. They knew I had a good job, but Walter spoke as if he had just handed me the keys to the kingdom. My mother moved so fast she nearly knocked over the gravy boat. She let out a loud, nervous laugh that sounded like a bark. She interrupted him, her voice shrill. She said, "Oh, Dad, you are embarrassing her. Lila is shy about money. You know that." She turned to the table, her eyes wide and manic. She said, "It was just a little gift. Everyone, just a little something to help with rent. You know how expensive the city is these days." She was rewriting reality in real time. She was trying to shrink a fortune down to a stocking stuffer. I looked at her. I saw the panic in her eyes. She was begging me, silently, to play along. She was pleading with me to be the accomplice she needed. I looked at Hannah. She was staring at her plate, her face pale, her hand gripping the table edge so hard her knuckles were white. I looked at Daniel. He had closed his eyes, as if waiting for a bomb to go off. And then I looked at Walter. He looked confused by my mother's interruption. He frowned, looking between Rebecca and me. I decided to end it. I did not stand up. I remained seated, my posture perfect. I picked up my wine glass. I looked directly at my grandfather, ignoring the frantic signals from my mother. I smiled the warmest, most innocent smile I could muster. I said, "Grandpa, thank you again for the $200. I really appreciate it. It will definitely help with gas for the drive back." The words hung in the air. Simple, polite, devastating. Walter froze. His smile evaporated. He lowered his glass slowly to the table. The confusion on his face deepened, then hardened into something sharp. He tilted his head, as if he had misheard me. He asked, "What $200? The room was dead silent now. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I kept my voice steady. I said, "The check Mom gave me today. From you. For $200. Walter turned his gaze to my mother. It was a look I had never seen him direct at her before. It was cold. It was assessing. Then he looked back at me. He spoke clearly, his voice projecting to the back of the room. He said, "Lila, I did not give you $200. The gift I gave you was $500,000. The number landed on the table like a physical weight. $500,000? $500,000? A gasp went around the room. My Aunt Linda dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against her china plate. Uncle Bob choked on his wine. Hannah made a small, strangled noise. Her spoon slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a metallic ring. Her face had drained of all color, leaving her makeup standing out like a mask. My mother stood up. She was shaking. She tried to laugh again, but this time it came out as a dry heave. She said, "Dad, stop it. You are confused. You are mixing up your numbers again." She looked around the table, waving her hands dismissively. She said, "He has been doing this lately. Everyone, his memory isn't what it used to be. He gets confused about the accounts. It is the medication." She was gaslighting him in front of 30 people. She was calling her own father senile to cover her tracks. Walter did not look senile. He looked furious. His face turned a dark shade of red. He slammed his hand down on the table, making the silverware jump. He roared that he was not confused. He said he wired the money himself in August. He said he sat in the bank manager's office and signed the papers. He turned to my father. He asked Daniel if he hadn't confirmed the transfer went through. Daniel opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who was drowning. He looked at Rebecca, then at the floor. He could not speak. The relatives were staring at us with open mouths. This was not a holiday squabble. This was a scandal unfolding in real time. The air was thick with judgment and shock. My mother turned to me, her eyes pleading, desperate, and angry all at once. She hissed at me to stop this. She said I was ruining everything. She said I knew Grandpa made mistakes. I sat there, calm in the eye of the hurricane. I felt a strange sense of detachment. I looked at the people who were supposed to protect me, the people who claimed to love me. I saw them for what they were. They were not family. They were parasites, and they had fed on the wrong host. I reached down into my bag, which I had placed by my feet. I felt the cool metal casing of the portable projector. I felt the weight of the blue folder. I picked up my napkin and dabbed the corner of my mouth. I folded it neatly and placed it on the table next to my plate. I looked at my mother, and for a split second, I let her see the truth in my eyes. I let her see that I knew everything. I let her see that I had not come here to eat turkey. I had come here to hunt. Then I turned to Walter. He was breathing hard, staring at his family with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. He looked like he was waiting for someone to tell him it was a joke. I spoke softly, but in the silence of the room, my voice carried to every corner. I said, "Grandpa, you are not confused, and you are not senile." I stood up. I picked up the small black device from my bag. I said, "Can I show you what actually happened to that money?" I walked toward the blank white wall at the end of the dining room. The feast was over. The trial was about to begin. I reached into my bag and pulled out the portable projector. It was a sleek, black cube, no larger than a hardcover book, but it hummed with a quiet, industrial power as I set it down on the lace tablecloth. I pushed a crystal vase of white roses to the side, clearing a line of sight to the blank, cream-colored wall behind my father's head. The room was suspended in a suffocating silence. 30 relatives sat frozen, their forks hovering over half-eaten pumpkin pie, their eyes darting between me and the device in my hand. I plugged the HDMI cable into my phone with a sharp, audible click. I did not ask for permission. I did not apologize for the interruption. I simply reached over and dimmed the dining room switch, plunging the table into a twilight gloom. A second later, a beam of pure white light cut through the darkness, hitting the wall with razor-sharp clarity. The first image appeared. It was a screenshot of the transaction history from the Frontier Trust joint account. I had enlarged the text so that even my great-aunt Martha at the far end of the table could read the numbers without her glasses. The header read, "Incoming wire transfer. Date August 14th. Amount $500,000. Sender Walter King." I stood next to the projection, my shadow casting a long, dark silhouette against the data. I pointed to the line. I asked my grandfather if he recognized this transaction. Walter squinted at the wall. He nodded slowly, his face grave. He said yes. He said that was exactly what he had sent. He looked around the table, addressing the silent audience. He explained that Daniel and Rebecca had advised him that the tax laws were changing this year. They told him that if he wanted to pass on a portion of the inheritance to me without the government taking 40%, he needed to move it into our joint account immediately. He said they told him it would be safe there, that it would sit and grow until I was ready to buy a house. A murmur went through the room. I saw my father flinch. The narrative was already shifting. They had not just stolen from me, they had manipulated an old man's fear of the government to facilitate the theft. I swiped my finger across my phone screen. The image on the wall changed. The new slide showed the activity from August 15th. Less than 24 hours later, the header read, "Outgoing wire transfer. Amount $499,800. I spoke clearly. I said the money did not sit. It did not grow. It left the account before the digital ink was even dry. I pointed to the destination field. I had run a trace on the routing number, and the result was displayed in bold red letters next to the bank data. The destination was a private checking account at a different bank. The account holder was Chase Lowell. Hannah let out a high-pitched, incredulous laugh. She shook her head violently, her diamond earrings catching the projector light. She shouted that I was crazy. She said her account must have been hacked. She looked at Chase, who was staring at his shoes, and then back at Walter. She said criminals hack bank accounts all the time, and that I was trying to frame them for a cybercrime. I anticipated this. Of course she would claim she was a victim. I swiped to the next slide. It was a technical log. It looked complicated to the uninitiated, a wall of text and timestamps. But I had highlighted the relevant sections in neon yellow. I explained that every time someone logs into a secure bank server, they leave a fingerprint. It is not a physical fingerprint, but it is just as unique. It records the device, the operating system, the browser, and the location. I read the data off the wall. Device MacBook Pro, 16-inch, operating system macOS Sonoma. Time of login, August 15th, 9:30 in the morning. Then, I split the screen. On the left was the bank login log. On the right was a screenshot from Hannah's Instagram story archive, dated August 15th at 9:35 in the morning. The photo showed Hannah's manicured hands resting on the keyboard of a brand new 16-inch MacBook Pro. The caption read, "Unboxing my new baby. Time to level up the business, boss babe." I looked at Hannah. I asked her if the hackers also unboxed her laptop and posted it to her social media account 5 minutes after they stole $500,000. The color drained from her face so completely that she looked like a marble statue. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The relative to her right, a cousin named Mike, shifted his chair a few inches away from her. The scraping sound loud in the quiet room. I did not give them time to recover. I swiped again, the screen filled with a document. It was a power of attorney form, granting Daniel Rhodes and Rebecca King Rhodes full legal authority to manage the assets of Lila Alexander. At the bottom of the page was a signature. It read, "Lila Alexander" in looping, flowing cursive. Below that document, I projected a scan of my actual driver's license and my passport. I pointed to the signatures. The difference was obvious even to a child. My real signature was sharp, angular, a quick scrawl born of signing hundreds of compliance reports. The signature on the form was round, bubbly, and slow. It was the handwriting of someone trying to draw a name, not sign it. I asked my mother if she recognized that penmanship. Rebecca stood up. Her chair fell backward with a crash. She was trembling, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Her eyes were wide, frantic, darting around the room looking for an ally, but finding only shocked stares. She stammered. She said she only signed it for my convenience. She said I was so busy in Denver, always working, always unreachable. She said she did not want to bother me with paperwork. She looked at Walter, tears welling in her eyes. She said she was just trying to help manage the family burden. She said, "Who really looks at signatures anyway? It was just a formality." The room gasped. It was a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the air. In her attempt to defend herself, she had just confessed to forgery in front of 30 witnesses. Walter looked at his daughter. His expression was one of pure devastation. He looked like a man watching his house burn down. Realizing too late that the arsonist was holding his hand, I swiped again. The screen changed to the Excel spreadsheet my father had sent me. I had highlighted the rows labeled Loan to Family Business and Marketing Fund. The total next to these rows was nearly $300,000. I turned to Daniel. He was weeping silently now, tears tracking through the sweat on his face. He did not look up. I said that there was no family business. There was no marketing fund. There was just a shell company and a series of transfers designed to hide the fact that they were bleeding the account dry. But I knew that documents could be dry. I knew that people could rationalize paperwork errors. I needed them to hear the intent. I needed them to hear the malice. I disconnected the HDMI cable from the video feed and tapped the audio file I had queued up. I told the room that I was going to play a recording of a phone call. I explained that this was a call between my parents and their former lawyer, Arthur Henderson, recorded on his office voicemail system, which had been forwarded to me in the email chain my father carelessly sent. I pressed play. The audio was grainy but intelligible. My mother's voice filled the room, stripped of its public sweetness. She sounded angry. She said, "Arthur, you have to find a way to make this work. We already spent the first installment. If Lila finds out, she will go crazy. She is obsessive about every penny. We need to paper this over before she comes home for Thanksgiving." Then my father's voice, weak and pleading. He asked if they could just classify it as a retroactive gift. Then Arthur Henderson's voice, stern and final. He said, "Rebecca, Daniel, I am telling you for the last time, this is fraud. I will not be a party to it." The recording ended with a click. The silence that followed was heavy, judgmental, and absolute. It was the sound of a reputation dying. My Aunt Linda stood up. She picked up her purse. She looked at Rebecca with a mixture of pity and disgust, and then she turned and walked out of the dining room without saying a word. Her husband followed her. Then my cousin Mike stood up. The table was fracturing. The family unit, so carefully preserved for decades, was dissolving under the weight of the truth. People were leaning away from my parents, creating a physical gap at the table as if greed were a contagious disease. I had one final nail to drive into the coffin. I reconnected the video feed. I swiped to the final slide. This was the lifestyle audit. It was a split-screen collage, a mosaic of vanity and theft. On the left side of the screen, I listed specific bank transaction dates and amounts. September 10th. Waldorf Astoria. Maldives, $12,000. October 4th. Wynn, Las Vegas. VIP Suite, $8,000. November 2nd. Cartier, Beverly Hills, $32,000. On the right side of the screen, I placed the corresponding photos from Hannah's Instagram. Hannah on the deck of the water villa, holding a coconut. Hannah in the casino, wearing a dress that cost more than my first car. And finally, a close-up of the engagement ring she had been flashing all night. The dates matched perfectly. The amounts matched perfectly. I looked at the ring on Hannah's finger. It no longer looked like a symbol of love. It looked like evidence. Hannah was sobbing now, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Chase was staring at the wall, his face blank, looking like a man calculating the distance to the nearest exit. I walked over to the wall and pulled the plug on the projector. The beam of light vanished, plunging the room back into the dim, candlelit reality, but the images were burned into everyone's retinas. I turned to Hannah. I looked at her, not with hatred, but with a cold, exhausted disappointment. She was my sister, and she had sold me for a collection of likes on an app. I spoke softly, my voice cutting through her sobs. I said, "Hannah, I understand wanting nice things. I really do. But if you were going to steal my future, the least you could have done was not post it in 4K. I picked up my napkin from the table and dropped it onto my untouched plate. The show was over. The verdict was in. Now, all that was left was the sentencing. The silence that followed my statement was not the kind of silence that happens in a library. It was the silence of a structure collapsing. It was the sound of the air leaving the room, sucked out by the sheer gravity of the evidence I had just plastered against the wall. Hannah was the first to break. She did not argue. She did not scream. She simply dissolved. It was a physical crumbling, her posture giving way as she slumped over the table, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders heaved with violent, jagged sobs that shook the crystal glasses near her plate. The carefully curated image of the successful entrepreneur, the boss babe, the globe-trotting influencer, vanished in an instant. All that was left was a 26-year-old girl who had been caught with her hand in a jar that was not hers. She looked up, her mascara running in dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks. She looked at me, then at Walter, her eyes wide and pleading. She said she just wanted a chance. Her voice was a wet, broken thing. She said everyone makes mistakes. She said she was going to pay it back. She pointed a trembling finger at Chase, who was staring fixedly at a stain on the tablecloth. She said Chase told her the return on investment would be massive. She said he promised her that within 6 months, she would have enough to put the $500,000 back before anyone even noticed it was gone. She said he told her she would double it. I watched her, feeling a cold pit in my stomach. She still did not get it. She was talking about returns and timelines. She was treating theft like a bridge loan. I told her clearly that this was not a mistake. A mistake is grabbing the wrong keys or forgetting a birthday. This was a plan. I told her that you do not accidentally forge a signature. You do not accidentally route money through a shell company. You do not accidentally spend $30,000 on jewelry. I turned my gaze from Hannah to my parents. I said it was not just her plan. I said she could not have done this without the people who taught her that consequences were for other people. Rebecca flushed a deep, blotchy crimson. For a moment, I thought she might apologize. I thought she might finally step into the role of a mother and take the bullet for her child. I was wrong. My mother stiffened. She wiped her eyes aggressively with her napkin and glared at me. Her sorrow transmuted instantly into defensive rage. She asked me why I had to be so cruel. She said I had always been this way, cold and calculating. She asked what the big deal was. She said I had a high-paying job. She said I had no husband, no children, no mortgage. She said I had more money than I knew what to do with. While my sister was struggling to build a life, she asked if it would really have killed me to help her out a little. She said I was acting like a victim when I was the one sitting on a pile of cash. I stared at her, fascinated by the twisted architecture of her morality. In her mind, my success was a crime that justified her theft. She had convinced herself that stealing from me was simply a form of unauthorized wealth redistribution. She did not see herself as a predator. She saw herself as Robin Hood, liberating funds from the selfish sister to give to the needy one who required first-class flights to the Maldives. Daniel tried to make himself small. He was hunched over his plate, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if the floor were tilting. When he felt the eyes of the room on him, he mumbled. He said he just did what he was told. He said Rebecca and Hannah said it was the only way. He said he just signed the papers they put in front of him. He said he never spent a dime of it himself. He looked at Walter, his eyes watery and weak. He said he was just trying to keep the peace. He said he did not want to be the bad guy. It was a pathetic defense, the Nuremberg defense of the suburban accountant. He wanted credit for his passivity, as if watching a crime happen and signing the permission slip was somehow noble because he did not personally hold the gun. A chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. My great-uncle Robert stood up. He was 80 years old, a man who had worked in a steel mill for 40 years and had never taken a handout in his life. He pointed a shaking finger at my parents. He shouted at them. He asked them what kind of people they were. He asked how they could look themselves in the mirror. He said they had robbed one child to spoil the other, and they had lied to an old man's face to do it. He said it was disgraceful. He said they were rot. The room murmured in agreement. The spell of polite society was broken. The relatives were no longer guests. They were a jury, and they had seen enough. Walter had not moved. He sat at the head of the table, his hands folded on the white tablecloth. He looked like a statue carved from granite. He had watched the slideshow. He had heard the recording. He had listened to his daughter justify theft and his son plead incompetence. He stood up slowly. The movement was heavy, burdened by the weight of the last hour. He looked at Rebecca, then he looked at Hannah. He spoke quietly, but his voice carried a resonance that silenced the room instantly. He said that when he went to the bank in August, he made a choice. He said he had been thinking about his will. He had been thinking about the legacy he was leaving behind. He knew Hannah was impulsive. He knew Rebecca enabled her. He knew I was distant. He said that when he transferred the $500,000, he gave explicit instructions to the bank not to notify me. He said he told only Rebecca and Hannah about the transfer. He told them it was a surprise. He told them he wanted them to be the ones to give me the good news. The room went deadly still. Walter looked at his family with eyes full of tears. He said it was a test. He said he wanted to see if they had enough honor to pick up the phone. He wanted to see if they would tell me the truth when there was no one watching, when they could easily take it for themselves. He said he told himself that if they called me, if they celebrated with me, he would divide the estate equally 3 ways. He said he wanted to believe they were good people. He paused, taking a ragged breath. He said that for 3 months. He waited. He checked his phone every day, hoping I would call to thank him. He hoped I would tell him that my mother had given me the message. But the phone never rang, and when he saw me tonight, and I thanked him for $200, he knew. He said they had not just stolen money, they had failed the final test. He said they had proven that they valued a quick payout more than they valued their blood. The revelation hit the table like a physical blow. Hannah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Rebecca looked as if she had been slapped. They had been playing a game of deception, thinking they were outsmarting a senile old man and an absent daughter, but the entire time, they were the rats in a maze that Walter had built. They had walked right into the trap, driven by their own greed. Rebecca let out a screech. It was an ugly, primal sound. She slammed her hands onto the table. She screamed that it was unfair. She shouted that it was entrapment. She said he had set them up to fail. She started listing excuses, her voice rising in pitch and volume. She talked about the inflation. She talked about the cost of her blood pressure medication. She talked about how the house needed a new roof. She talked about how hard it was to keep up appearances in this town. She blamed the economy. She blamed the government. She blamed the bank. She blamed everyone and everything except the person staring back at her in the mirror. It was a masterclass in narcissism. Even faced with the proof that her father had tested her integrity and found it rotting, she could only frame herself as the victim of a cruel experiment. Hannah was frantic. She saw her inheritance evaporating. She saw the lifestyle she felt entitled to slipping through her fingers. She grabbed her phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped it once before fumbling to unlock it. She said she could fix this. She said Chase was real. She said he was a genius. She said he had the money. She said she would call him right now and he would explain everything to Grandpa. She said he would wire the money back tonight. She stabbed at the screen, initiating a FaceTime call. She held the phone up, turning the screen so we could all see. The ringing sound echoed in the quiet room. It was a lonely digital trill, connecting. The screen showed a gray background. We waited. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. The call was declined. Hannah stared at the phone. Stunned, she dialed again. 1 ring. Decline. She looked up, panic rising in her chest. She said he must be in a meeting. She said he was probably closing a deal in Tokyo. She started typing a text message, her thumbs flying across the glass. She narrated as she typed, her voice trembling. She said she was telling him it was an emergency. She said she was telling him to call her back immediately. We watched the 3 little dots appear on the screen. He was typing. Hannah let out a sob of relief. She said, "See? He is answering. He is going to clear this up." A message bubble appeared on the screen. The font was large enough for me to read from across the table. The message read, Lose my number. I do not do drama. Then, a second notification appeared at the bottom of the screen. This user has blocked you. The silence that returned to the room was absolute. It was heavy with the weight of a complete and total reality check. Hannah stared at the words. She tapped the screen, but nothing happened. The blue bubbles turned green. The calls went straight to voicemail. The man she had posted about, the man she had stolen for, the man she was going to marry, had cut her loose the moment the water got hot. He had taken the money, taken the trips, taken the prestige, and the second she became a liability, he deleted her existence. She was not a partner. She was not a fiancée. She was a mark. She was an ATM that had finally run out of cash, and so she had been discarded. She dropped the phone onto her plate. It landed with a dull thud in the remains of her cranberry sauce. She did not cry this time. She just stared at the device, looking like a person who had just watched their house slide off a cliff. Walter looked at her. He looked at the phone lying in the food. He looked at Rebecca, who was still panting from her outburst. He looked at Daniel, who had covered his face with his hands. His face transformed. The anger drained away, leaving behind a profound, crushing exhaustion. It was the look of a man who realizes that his life's work, not the buildings, not the money, but the family he raised, was a failure. He spoke to them, his voice thick with grief. He said this was never about the money. He said he would have given them the money if they had asked. He said he would have paid off the debts. He said he would have bought the ring. He said what broke him was the price tag they put on his trust. He said they sold his faith in them for a handbag. He said they sold their own sister for a vacation. He said they sold their dignity for a man who just blocked them via text message. He said he thought he had raised them to have a spine. He thought he had raised them to know the difference between price and value. But he saw now that he was wrong. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own phone. It was an old model, worn at the edges. He placed it on the table next to his wine glass. He looked at me. He gave me a small, sad nod. It was an acknowledgement. It was an apology. Then he looked back at his daughter and his granddaughter. He stood up straighter, squaring his shoulders. The general was back, but this time, he was not reviewing his troops. He was dismissing them. He said, "If there is no line you will not cross for a handbag, then I have to draw one for you." He picked up the phone and dialed 3 digits. He did not look down. He held the phone to his ear and looked straight ahead, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance that none of us could see. He spoke into the receiver. He said, "I need the police. I would like to report a theft." The hallway outside the dining room was cool and smelled faintly of lemon oil and old dust. It was a narrow passage lined with portraits of ancestors who had built this family from nothing. Stern-faced men and women who would have looked at the scene unfolding beneath them with utter contempt. Walter walked with a heavy, determined gait. The phone pressed to his ear. I followed him, keeping a distance of 3 paces, watching the back of his jacket strain against his shoulders. He looked like a man marching to his own execution, or perhaps the execution of the life he thought he had. I heard him speak. His voice was low, a rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He stated his name. He stated his address. Then he said the words that would cleave our history into 2 distinct eras before the call and after. He said he needed to report a theft. He said the amount was substantial. He said the victim was his granddaughter. The reality of those words hit the air like a chemical reaction. Before he could finish the sentence, the dining room doors burst open behind us. My parents did not walk out. They scrambled. It was a frantic, undignified rush. Rebecca reached him first. She threw herself at him, grabbing the arm that held the phone. Her face was a mask of terrified mascara and blotchy red panic. She begged him to hang up. She screamed that he was making a mistake. She said he was going to destroy the family over a misunderstanding. She promised they would fix it. She said they would sell the house. She said they would sell the cars. She said they would pay me back every cent if he just gave them time. Daniel fell to his knees on the oriental rug. I had never seen my father kneel before anyone. He looked small, shrunken inside his dress shirt. He clutched at the hem of Walter's jacket, sobbing. He said they would do anything. He said he would take a second job. He said, please do not let them be branded as criminals. He kept repeating that he was an accountant, that a record would end his career, that they would be destitute. Then came Hannah. She pushed past me, smelling of expensive perfume and fear. She threw herself onto the floor at Walter's feet, wrapping her arms around his legs, burying her face in his trousers. It was a performance, but it was also genuine terror. She was a child realizing that the adult world had teeth. She cried that she was sorry. She said she made a mistake, but then she played the only card she had left. She looked up at him, her eyes swimming in tears, and said she was still his grandchild. She said his own flesh and blood could not go to prison. She said he loved her. She appealed to the biology that bound us, assuming it was a shield that could deflect the penal code. Walter did not move. He did not kick them away, but he did not comfort them. He stood there, a marble pillar surrounded by a rising tide of desperation. He lowered the phone slowly, pressing it against his chest, covering the microphone. The operator was likely still on the line, listening to the muffled sounds of a family imploding. I stood in the doorway, watching them. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It was not triumph. It was nausea. This was the family I had spent my life trying to impress. These were the people whose approval I had sought with good grades, with a stable career, with being the responsible one. And now, here they were, groveling on the floor, bargaining for their freedom with money they did not have. I felt a pull from two directions. On one side was the instinct of the daughter, the biological imperative to protect the pack. If I let Walter finish that call, if I signed the affidavit sitting in my bag, I was lighting a match that would burn their lives to the ground. My father would lose his license. My mother would be a pariah at the country club. Hannah would have a felony record before she turned 30. The King name, which Walter had polished for 50 years, would be dragged through the mud of the local court system. On the other side was the instinct of the woman I had become, the professional. The person who knew that data did not lie and that actions had equal and opposite reactions. I remembered the office of Marcus Thorne, the criminal defense attorney in Denver. I remembered the way the afternoon light hit his glass desk as he looked at my evidence. I remembered his voice, cool and detached. He had told me that not acting was also a choice. He said that if I walked away, I was sending a message. He said I would be telling them that I was a safe target. He said I would be teaching them that they could carve pieces out of me whenever they were hungry, and I would thank them for the privilege. Walter looked down at the people clutching his legs. Then he looked up at me. For the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. He was the patriarch, the decision-maker, the check writer, but in this moment, he was just an old man with a broken heart, standing over the wreckage of his lineage. He spoke to me. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding together. He said this money was mine. He asked me what I wanted him to do. The hallway went silent. Even Rebecca stopped screaming. They all turned to look at me. 3 pairs of eyes locked onto my face. Hannah looked hopeful. She thought she knew me. She thought I was the pushover big sister who always folded, who always smoothed things over. Rebecca looked demanding. Her eyes bored into mine, silently commanding me to fix this, to take the fall, to be the bigger person one last time. Daniel just looked afraid. I held the blue folder against my side. I could feel the sharp corner of the plastic digging into my ribs. I did not answer Walter immediately. Instead, I took a step forward. I looked down at my parents. I asked them a question. My voice was steady, stripped of all emotion. I asked them to imagine a scenario where I had not found the bank logs. I asked them to imagine that I had stayed in Denver, that I had never come home, that I had never seen the spreadsheet. I asked them what would have happened 10 years from now, or 20, when Grandpa passed away. I asked them, point blank, if I had not discovered this myself, would you have ever told me about the $500,000 gift? The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. I waited. I watched my mother's face. I saw her open her mouth to speak, to offer some reflexive lie, But then she stopped. She knew that I knew. She knew that any lie she told now would be disproven by the history of her own silence. She closed her mouth. She looked away. I watched my father. He stared at the pattern in the rug. His hand trembled violently. He could not look at me. The answer was in the silence. It was loud and absolute. No, they would never have told me. They would have let me live my entire life thinking my grandfather had left me nothing. They would have let me struggle to pay a mortgage, let me worry about retirement, let me doubt Walter's love for me, all while they spent my future on luxury cars and vacations. They did not steal from me because they were desperate. They stole from me because they did not respect me. They saw me not as a person with dreams and rights, but as a resource to be harvested. They thought I was rich enough to absorb the loss. They thought I was successful enough not to need the help. They had penalized me for my competence and rewarded Hannah for her incompetence. The realization hardened the last soft place in my heart. I looked at Walter. I saw that he had heard the silence too. He closed his eyes for a brief second, a spasm of pain crossing his face. I spoke to him. I said that if we kept this quiet, we were teaching them that I was just a wallet with legs. I said we would be teaching everyone at that dining table that his trust meant nothing, that his word was negotiable. I said I could not live with that. I said I could not sit at a table with people who viewed my existence as an insurance policy against their own greed. From the dining room doorway, a few relatives had gathered. My cousin Mike was there. Great-uncle Robert stood behind him. Uncle Bob stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously. He looked at the scene, the kneeling parents, the crying sister, and his instinct for preservation kicked in. He said we should really think about this. He said these things are best handled internally. He said we did not want the neighbors talking. He said we could work out a payment plan. He said family business should stay behind closed doors. Others behind him nodded. They were not defending the theft. They were defending the status quo. They were terrified of the scandal. They wanted the comfort of the lie rather than the brutality of the truth. But some remained silent. Aunt Linda, who had walked out earlier, stood in the shadows of the porch, watching. She did not step forward to defend Rebecca. She waited. She was measuring the wind. Walter looked at Bob. Then he looked down at his daughter, who was still gripping his arm. He gently, but firmly, peeled her fingers off his jacket. He stepped back, creating a physical distance between himself and the people on the floor. He nodded to me. He said then we would tell the truth. He said we would let the law do what he had failed to do as a father. He admitted it then. He admitted that his generosity had been a crutch that crippled them. He admitted that by shielding them from the consequences of their small mistakes over the years, he had emboldened them to make this catastrophic one. He took responsibility not for their crime, but for the environment that allowed it to fester. Rebecca gasped. She realized the shield was gone. She realized that the family card had been declined. Walter lifted the phone back to his ear. He did not shout. He did not tremble. He told the operator he was still there. He told them he would like an officer to come to the house to take a statement regarding a case of wire fraud and identity theft. He gave them the gate code. He hung up. The sound of the call ending was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Daniel slumped onto the floor, putting his head between his knees. Hannah stopped crying and just stared at the ceiling. Catatonic. Rebecca looked at me with pure, distilled hatred. It was the look of a woman who would blame me for this until the day she died. She would never see herself as the villain. She would only see me as the traitor who called the cops. I could live with her hatred. I could not live with her pity. Walter straightened his jacket. He motioned for me to follow him. We walked back into the dining room. The relatives who had been hovering in the doorway parted like the Red Sea. We walked to the head of the table. The room was still dark, illuminated only by the candles and the faint, ghostly glow of the blank projector screen. The half-eaten pumpkin pies sat on the plates, congealing. Walter stood at the head of the table. He waited until every eye was on him. He spoke to the gathered extended family. He did not sugarcoat it. He did not use euphemisms. He announced that there had been a theft of $500,000. He announced that the perpetrators were his daughter, his son-in-law, and his granddaughter Hannah. He said that silence was a currency he was no longer willing to spend. He announced that tomorrow morning, at 9 o'clock, he and I would be driving to the police station to hand over the physical evidence and sign the formal complaints. He looked around the room, challenging anyone to object. He said that anyone who wished to support Rebecca and Daniel in this matter was free to leave his house right now. He said that anyone who stayed was staying to support the truth. It was a line in the sand. It was a declaration of war against the hypocrisy that had rotted the family tree from the inside out. He turned the threat into a public commitment. By saying it in front of everyone, he burned the bridge back to handling it privately. There would be no morning after change of heart. There would be no secret settlements. The witnesses were here. The narrative was set. I looked at the faces around the table. Some looked down. Some looked terrified. But Great-Uncle Robert nodded. Aunt Linda, standing by the window, nodded. I stood next to my grandfather. For the first time since I arrived in Redwood Falls, I did not feel like the outlier. I did not feel like the anomaly. We were a team. We were the firewall, and we had just blocked the intrusion. I looked toward the hallway where my parents and sister were still huddled on the floor. I felt a profound sense of loss. Yes. But beneath it, I felt the solid, cold ground of self-respect. I had lost a family I never really had, but I had saved the one person who mattered. And tomorrow, the data would have its day in court. The sun rose over Redwood Falls with a bleak, gray light that made the frost on the lawn look like ash. The house, usually vibrating with the noise of a holiday morning, was as silent as a tomb. The driveway, which had been packed bumper to bumper with SUVs and sedans just 12 hours ago, was nearly empty. The relatives had fled at first light. They had packed their bags and slipped away while the coffee was still brewing. Terrified of the contamination that comes from proximity to a scandal. Nobody wanted to be subpoenaed. Nobody wanted their name in a police report. They left us to rot in the mess we had made. I walked down the main staircase, my heels clicking loudly on the wood. Hannah was sitting on the bottom step. She was still wearing the dress from the night before, the fabric wrinkled and stained. Her face was swollen, her eyes red-rimmed and glassy. She was clutching her designer handbag to her chest, hugging the empty leather sack as if it were a teddy bear. She was rocking back and forth slightly. She kept muttering to herself. She said it was just a stupid mistake. She said she did not understand why everyone was acting like she had killed someone. She said it was just money. She was stuck in a loop of denial, unable to process that the world operated on laws, not on intentions. I stepped past her. She did not look up. She was mourning the death of her lifestyle, not the loss of her integrity. I walked into the kitchen. My parents were there. They were standing by the island, leaning in close to each other, whispering furiously. They looked exhausted, aged 10 years in a single night. When I crossed the threshold, they stopped talking instantly. They pulled apart and looked at me. Their eyes were cold. There was no warmth, no parental concern. I was no longer their daughter. I was the prosecution. I was the outsider who had breached their perimeter. Walter was waiting for me in the foyer. He was wearing a suit I recognized from old photos, a charcoal wool blend that he had likely bought 20 years ago. It was out of fashion, the lapels a little too wide, but it was pressed sharp enough to cut skin. He had shaved. He had combed his silver hair. He held his leather briefcase in one hand, his knuckles pale against the handle. He looked at me. His eyes were clear. The heartbreak was still there, buried deep, but overlaid with a layer of steely resolve. He asked me quietly if I was ready. I nodded. I had my blue folder. I had the USB drives. I had the truth. We walked toward the heavy oak front door. My hand was reaching for the knob when I felt a grip on my arm. It was my father, Daniel. He had followed us from the kitchen. He did not look angry. He looked desperate. His face was pale, his lips trembling. He squeezed my arm, his fingers digging into the fabric of my blazer. He whispered to me. He said I had the power to destroy my sister's entire life with a single signature. He said she was young. He said a criminal record would follow her forever. He tried to put the weight of her future on my conscience. He tried to make me the villain of the story, the executioner of her potential. I looked at his hand on my arm. Then I looked at his face. I felt nothing. The well of guilt he was trying to draw from was dry. I pulled my arm back, breaking his grip. I stepped away from him, creating a physical boundary that matched the emotional one. I told him that Hannah had already destroyed her own life. I told him she made that choice the moment she practiced forging my signature on a legal document. I told him that today, I was not destroying anything. I was simply signing my own name, for myself, for the first time in months. I turned my back on him. I opened the door and walked out into the cold morning air. I did not look back to see if he was crying. I did not care. The drive to the police station was silent. Walter drove his old sedan with both hands on the wheel. Staring straight ahead, the town of Redwood Falls passed by the windows. Sleepy and innocent, people were walking dogs. People were buying coffee. They had no idea that the pillar of their community was on his way to dismantle his own legacy. The police station was a low brick building that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. It was quiet. A desk sergeant sat behind a high counter, typing slowly on a computer. He looked up when we approached. He recognized Walter. He smiled and started to ask how the holiday was. But the look on my grandfather's face stopped him mid-sentence. Walter placed his briefcase on the counter. He said we were there to file a formal complaint regarding grand larceny, forgery, and wire fraud. The sergeant blinked. He straightened up, his demeanor shifting from neighborly to professional. He called for a detective. We were led into a small interview room. It was gray and windowless, with a metal table and 4 chairs. A detective entered a few minutes later, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense haircut. She sat down and opened a notebook. I took the lead. I did not speak like a grieving granddaughter. I spoke like a consultant delivering a quarterly report. I opened my blue folder. I laid out the evidence in a grid on the metal table. I presented the bank logs. I presented the IP tracking data. I presented the forged power of attorney. I presented the email chain where my parents discussed finding a corrupt lawyer. I presented the dossier on Chase Lowell and his history of bankruptcy and fraud. The detective listened. She did not interrupt. She picked up the documents, examining them with a professional detachment. Occasionally, she would look up at me, assessing my credibility. I met her gaze every time. I answered every question with precision. I did not speculate. I did not embellish. I gave her the data. When I was finished, the room was quiet. The detective leaned back in her chair. She looked at the pile of evidence, then at Walter, and finally at me. She asked the difficult question. She asked if I understood what this meant for the people involved. She asked if, considering they were immediate family, I wanted to pursue a different avenue. She was offering me an out. She was giving me a chance to downgrade this to a civil dispute, to keep it out of the criminal courts. I looked at Walter. He was watching me. He was not signaling me to stop. He was waiting to see if I would hold the line. I looked back at the detective. I told her clearly that my goal was not to put my family in prison for the sake of punishment. My goal was to strip them of the ability to use my identity as a weapon. I told her I wanted a paper trail that proved, legally and irrefutably, that I was not a party to their debts. And I told her about Chase. I told her that a predator was using my sister to launder money, and if we did not file this report, he would vanish and do it to someone else. I said I wanted him investigated. I wanted his shell company exposed. I said I could not let that happen. The detective nodded. She pushed 2 forms across the table. Walter went first. He took a pen from his pocket. His hand shook slightly as he hovered over the paper. I knew what he was feeling. He was signing a document that admitted he had failed to protect his assets and his values, but he did not hesitate. He pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name in a firm, dark script, Walter King. Then he slid the papers to me. I picked up the pen. It felt heavy. The plastic barrel was cool against my fingers. I looked at the signature line. I thought about the Thanksgiving dinners of my childhood. I thought about the bike rides with my father. I thought about my mother brushing my hair. I thought about the sister I used to share a room with. If I signed this, those memories would be tainted forever. They would be the prologue to a tragedy. But then I thought about the empty bank account. I thought about the lies. I thought about the $200 check my mother had handed me, smiling while she picked my pocket. I realized that the family I was mourning did not exist. It was a fiction I had maintained to keep myself warm. The reality was the people who had left me to rot. I lowered the pen. I signed my name, Lila Alexander. The letters were sharp, angular, and final. The detective took the papers. She gathered the evidence into a file. She stood up. She said that from here, it was their job. She said my job was done. She said I had told the truth, and that was all I could do. We walked out of the interview room. The air in the hallway felt different. It was thinner. It was cleaner. We pushed through the double glass doors and stepped out into the parking lot. The sun had broken through the clouds. The light was bright and harsh, reflecting off the windshields of the police cruisers. I stopped for a moment and looked at our reflection in the glass of the station doors. I saw an old man in a suit and a young woman in a blazer. We looked like strangers. We looked like survivors. We were the only two members of the King family who had chosen the hard road of truth over the easy path of deception. We had paid for our integrity with our bloodline. Walter turned to me. He adjusted his hat. He looked tired, incredibly tired, but the shadow of shame that had hung over him the night before was gone. He smiled. It was a sad smile, full of grief, but it was also full of a deep, abiding respect. He spoke softly. He said that last night I had thanked him for $200. He paused, looking me in the eye. He said that today I had proved that I was worth far more than any amount he could ever wire. I did not answer. I did not need to. I just took his arm, and we walked toward the car together. I knew he was right. The $500,000 was gone. The family was broken. But as I walked across the asphalt, I felt a profound sense of wealth. I possessed something they could never steal, could never forge, and could never spend. I owned myself, and that was a fortune that would last me a lifetime. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on what you would have done in my shoes. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people.